All right, welcome to what's potentially another episode of Mike's Sword Hospital, or maybe a spin-off series. Because in the comments, you've requested content on sword maintenance and, yes, customization. So, yeah, I listened to you guys. So I wanted to start today by talking about disassembling, shall we say, a particularly stubborn reproduction Japanese-style sword. Now, some of you guys, like me, collect these, and especially the lower-end models, this is a common issue. If you've had any experience with the actual traditionally made Nihonto, or higher-end reproductions, maybe you've watched the videos, maybe you've had the experience in the training yourself in your Koryu. You know that it's kind of a delicate process, or at least it should be. You use a really tiny mallet to carefully tap out one, maybe two pins, and then just a little bit of tap on the back of the Tsuka and everything slides apart. But with a lot of these reproductions, that's not how it happens. Like, not at all, to the point where some of you have probably tried to get your Tsuka off and given up because you're afraid you're going to destroy something. It's on that tight. So I wanted to address that today, starting with, okay, how does it happen? And again, especially in lower end swords, your blade might be handmade, hand-finished, and in the process of that, they might be shaping the Nakago within a certain specification. But pretty sure that your Tsuka is going to be, at least especially in the core, mass-produced. And the same thing with some of your other fittings. They're not made for the sword specifically at some of these lower price ranges. So there might be some filing and shaping, but you know, that takes time. So to cut costs, that's going to be minimal. So what they're going to do is they're going to put on, hopefully, habaki, seppa, and tsuba that fit. They might do a little bit of filing, but the rule here is always going to be tighter is better than looser. Buyers really get triggered by loose parts on swords, right? So if it's still just a little too tight to fit, they might finish it off by hammering it in place with a mallet. Hopefully they don't do any damage in the process, but that can make those parts really stubborn to budge. They're hammered on. Same with the Tsuka core. Generic Tsuka core, they might try to basically shove it on, hammer it on with a mallet. At that point, it's the core, the fuchi, and probably the same. Might be fully wrapped to begin with. Depending on the build, it might be just all in one piece ready to go. Hammer the thing on. Now, if it doesn't completely fit, some of you have seen on your Nakago gouges from grinders that don't seem to fit the rest of the shaping. Yeah, they might just shear some steel off and try it again. And if it's too loose, they'll shove some shims in there, maybe some epoxy, hammer it in, make it nice and tight. Hopefully they don't crack the Tsuka core in the process, which is a good reason for you to take the sword apart and examine it. Because that's a potential failure point, and it does happen. Hopefully it didn't. But at this point in these swords, there are no pinholes in either the Nakago or the Tsuka. So after they've hammered it all down, they're going to put it into press, and they're going to just drill through the whole thing. Now, if you've ever drilled through metal, what's going to happen is that drill bit potentially is going to pull metal flash through the wooden Tsuka core. Like barbs or even almost like a rough rivet. That's going to further prevent any kind of smooth removal of this Tsuka. It's going to make for a really tight build, but it might make it almost impossible to get the sword apart without breaking something. Well, hopefully it's not quite that bad, and, well, let me show you my method for doing that. Now, this is where I warn you, and I might get a little bit demonetized here by YouTube for showing you something dangerous. Do as I say, not as I do. I do cut a few corners related to my own safety based on a combination of my experience and, yes, my laziness. So I will talk about how to do this safer than maybe what I'm showing you. What are you going to need to do this? Well, I strongly recommend that if you don't have one in your cleaning kit, get yourself a good punch that fits the diameter of your Makugi pins. All right, you're going to need that. Invest in at least one good soft nylon, rubber, both, mallet. And yes, for this particular job, you're going to need a kind of a stout flathead screwdriver. All right, let's do a little scary surgery. Okay, you're probably going to get sick of me saying carefully, slowly, and gently over and over again, but that's our mantra today. Because you are going to be putting potentially significant impact into this end of the weapon. So my first dangerous piece of advice is do this work with the sword out of the saya, because that impact can translate into the saya and the shock can split the saya. But that means you're working with an exposed sharp blade, so precautions. Now in an ideal situation, you've got a workshop, good sturdy workbench, solid vise that you could pad the jaws of so it doesn't mangle your blade. You can clamp your blade in there and we can work any impact we need this way. And we'll talk about why that's better than what I'm going to do. But what I'm going to show you today is, assuming you don't have those things, what I call the living room, bedroom, apartment version of this procedure. And for that, you're going to need, well, a surface big enough with clearance to lay the sword down that you can pad with a blanket or a towel or something like that. Not only to protect the sword, but it helps keep parts from flying off. And I've already done that, laid the sword down on it, used my mallet and my pin punch to remove the Mikugi pins. Now in this Murasame build, they're nicely rounded, but they're also tapered. Be aware that your pins might only go in and out in one direction. That might be from the same side or opposite sides of the Tsuka. It depends on the build. Usually it becomes apparent pretty quick into the procedure once you take a quick look at things. I got the pins out. Now, I'm going to be working impact this way instead of, well, ideally that way. Now, if it was in a vise and I was hitting this way, well, there's a risk it might fly out of the vise at you. So again, proceeding carefully, slowly, gently, okay, a little bit at a time. But my biggest risk here is potential damage to the tsuba, especially this design where there's a lot of metal removed here versus one that's more solid. There's a risk of bending it. But otherwise, the impact is translating into the fuchi, into the tsuka core. It's usually pretty well supported. But for this method, I'm going to be going the other way, which means the impact is potentially going into the habaki, which is fragile. Not only is it soft brass or copper that is then being struck in the direction of some hard steel, but when it comes to impact, not only am I worried about damaging the tsuba, I'm going to be putting heavier impacts into the backside as compared to the front side. The backside is going into the shelf there of that munamachi, the base of the spine, right? It's the strongest part of the habaki, where it's most supported. I'm going to be really, really gentle, careful about any impacts I'm putting more towards the front, because there's a high risk that the base of that blade, the hamachi, will split your habaki. How do I know? Yeah, I've done it before. And then you need new parts. Now this could be done flat on the surface, but I do find that certain of these impacts work a whole lot better with the sword vertical. You'll notice I'm wearing a glove. I should probably be wearing two. But the other thing you're going to need, between my feet down here where you can't see, I got a good sturdy cutting board, something I can sink the tip of the sword into. It's not going to split it, cut through it, but also hopefully will not damage the kasaki of my sword, which is a high risk for this. So again, gently, carefully, yeah, over and over again I'm going to say it. It's also why I'm not a particular fan of really long kasaki. They tend to be more fragile, but hopefully a sword can handle what I'm about to do without taking any damage, ideally. Or if you don't have that, just a good solid block of wood that, again, is not going to split or hopefully damage your sword that you can sink the tip into. All right, like I said, some of this can be done with it laying on the flat surface, but some of it I find is easier to do. I get better leverage and control if I'm doing it vertically. So what I'm doing here is I'm hovering the tip just a little bit off that wood. If it were to suddenly break and fly free, Nihonto is still full length. It's not going to go far. All right. It seems like it's pretty dangerous, but I've actually found it can scare you, but it should, if you're hanging onto the Tsuka, it's not going anywhere. As long as you've only got a little bit of room between the tip and what it's potentially going to hit down here. And you only want a little bit of a distance. And then I'm going to take my soft mallet, and I'm going to carefully, again, starting from the back of the tsuba, a little bit around the side, maybe a little bit around the front. What I'm looking for is to create a gap between the tsuba and the fuchi. All right? And I don't need a big one. I just need enough that I can carefully, without scratching or gouging anything up, I'm looking to get a space that I can use to get that screwdriver in there between the fuchi and the seppa. So that's going to take just a little bit of doing here. A little bit in the front, very gently, a bit more in the back. There we go. I'm starting to see a little daylight. All right, can I get it in there? And once I can get it in there, what I'm going to do is, okay, I got some space to work. Tips going into the wood, so nothing's going anywhere. And I'm going to try to work this little improvised pry bar around the fuchi. Just a little bit here, a little bit there. And, you know, a couple of millimeters at a time is all I really want, all right? And if I need an extra bit of tappa, I'm going to again raise the sword tip just a slight distance off that board. A little bit more, especially at the back, maybe just a little bit around everywhere else. Very gently, very slowly. Get the screwdriver back in there. And there's what I call a breaking point, where everything just suddenly kind of comes free, just like that. Now, the first time you do this, be prepared for a snowstorm of wood shavings, maybe epoxy dust, maybe metal shavings, maybe corrosion, hopefully not. But a couple of things you're going to immediately want to check. One, should be able to pull the fuchi off the Tsuka core and see if it's cracked. This one is a little scary seam there, but no, it's solid. If it's cracked, you might be able to glue and vise it back together, or it might require rebuild replacement of your entire Tsuka, but it's a good thing to know. All right, also tells you if it's been shimmed or anything else. And you get to examine your Nihonto. For the sake of dealing with fit issues, one of the things that I'm going to specifically look for, that I've already dealt with on this one, around the pinholes, are there any snags, any flash from drilling through it? Those are going to need to be filed smooth, and there was some, and I've already taken it down. That's usually what's causing the greatest amount of resistance, getting that Tsuka core off. So taking a little bit of time to smooth up any snags, and might clean it up while you're at it. Now, this is a good example, and I'm not going to go through full disassembly yet. Maybe in another video, if we want to talk about fitting a new tsuba to a sword, let me know in the comments if that's something you want to see. But this is a good example of a tsuba and habaki and even the seppa. They've been hammered in place. So yeah, they're kind of forced there. So there's not going to be any looseness, but removing them is going to require more impact, and it's actually even slightly scarier than what I've just shown you. So potential topic for another video. But, okay. If we're ready for reassembly, get the fuchi back on, facing in the right direction, and then insert the tang back inside again, facing in the right direction. Have I ever tried to put a sword back together backwards? Yeah. Should be pretty free up until about, well, an inch or so, couple 3 centimeters. It's when you start hitting resistance. All right. This again is a great time for this vertical practice. Going to need some counter resistance to do this. So into the block, into the board, tip down. I might get lucky. I might just be able to, you know, use a hand and tap it in. That would be awesome. How do I check my work? I take my pin punch and slide it into the Mikugi pinholes. And if I can feel a snag of the tang, remember these were drilled clean through, they should be smooth. I'm not quite there yet. Couple of taps, again, just a little bit at a time. I'm not driving a railroad spike here. hopefully not driving a railroad spike here. Yep, still feel a little bit. Still feel a little bit. Sometimes you can look in there and see whether it's clear, but I like to have that tactile feedback. A little bit more. You can also check, see if there's any gaps or unevenness here in your seppas and tsuba and everything. All right, one more test. Just a little bit more, maybe. And there we go. Nice and clean. At this point, hopefully, your pins go back in with just a little bit of tapping in. You can lay it down on the flat surface to do this part. That's no problem. And if you need any adjustment in terms of the depth of the pin, if you go, it's too shallow or you go too far, laying it down on the surface and getting your pin punch, making adjustments. But back together, should be nice and tight. No damage, no injuries. Hopefully, that's as scary as it gets. And again, this might be a little disturbing to you traditionalists, but we're talking about a not necessarily traditionally made reproduction blade that might have some issues in that build. So hopefully this was helpful. If you have your own methods or if you have any questions, let's get our conversation going as always in the comments. Let me know what else you might like to see. Was this even useful? Let me know. I'm open to criticism. And direction, where you want to go next. Speaking of which, until, well, we figure out where that is, thanks as always for watching, following my journey, subscribing to the channel, sharing the videos, liking the videos, adding to our conversation, and I do hope to see you back for, well, whatever the next is.